would be the next important question to answer. Third one is, what is the intellectual context for this work, right? How does the work that you've done grow out of, expand on, or improve upon previous work? Okay, so you want to start to show the reader what are connections that can be made between what you've accomplished and what people have done before you. Number 4, what methods did you use? Okay, number 5, what are your findings? Usually you want to have, what are your findings, or maybe what are your findings so far? You want to have those probably as close to the top of this abstract as possible, maybe the second or third sentence if you can. Okay, and this is essentially the same, or very related to, what is your unique contribution? All right, and finally, what are some possible applications for the work that you've done? So I'm going to harp for a moment on what is your unique contribution, right? So something else people, well, don't always realize is that when you're doing research, really each paper should be a unique contribution, meaning that it's something new, it's something that hasn't been done before, right? That's what we're doing when we're doing research. We're trying to discover new knowledge, tell the world about what that knowledge is that we discovered. And so your unique contribution, you want to make sure it's very clear what that is, in your abstract especially, but also throughout the paper. You want to say, always clearly differentiate what is yours, what did you come up with, and what was there already in the past. Okay, these are two very important things. And so by understanding very succinctly and concisely what is your unique contribution, this is going to help your reader realize what is the importance of this article. All right? Good. So these are the things that you want to have in your abstract. Now, I don't recommend that you try to write your abstract directly in the space allocated, whatever it may be, 150, 250 words. Don't try to answer all of these questions in that amount of space on your first try. Right? Abstracts are very difficult things to write, I would say. And so I'll come back to this at the end, but usually a good way to do it is just to first answer each one of these questions with as much space as you need, and then go through the process of revising and coming up with more and more concise ways to present this material. Make it as concise as you can. Okay? Good. So after the abstract typically comes the introduction, and the purpose of the introduction now is going to be to put your work in context. Okay, so what is the context, and again, what is the contribution of your work? Now, in the introduction, you're usually no longer limited by space, right? So you don't have to fit all this into one paragraph. This is where you want to start to tell the story of what research you accomplished, what is the work you did, and why did you do that? Okay, so you want to explain to the reader why you started this project. All right? Oftentimes, this may be easier to explain after you have results and you understand what those results are, right? Usually going into a project, you have some idea of what it is you hope to accomplish, but it doesn't always go directly in that direction. You don't always get to exactly the results that you wanted. So you can say write an initial introduction up front, but usually this is something that I try to write towards the end of the writing process. Throughout this, you want to tell a story. So you want to say what is the historical development that led up to where your work fits in. And this is one point where it's important to think back to who is your audience. All right? So based off of who your audience is, that sort of dictates where you start the story that led to this research. Right? If you're writing to a very broad audience, then you really want to give a good historical development so that they can see, really starting from a point in history that they're going to be familiar with, what are the developments that led up to the project and the conclusions that you've drawn. Right? If you're writing to a much more specific technical audience who are already experts in this field, okay, it's still important that you give some of this story or some of this background, right? So, for example, Philip, who's sitting in the back, is doing a project with me this summer on network anomaly detection. And so let's suppose for a moment that we were writing an article to a conference which focuses specifically on network anomaly detection. All right, so in your opinion, do you think we need to motivate to these people why network anomaly detection is an important problem? Would you say yes, no? No? Okay, right? Because all these people who are going to this conference want to talk about anomaly detection. So they're already into this problem. They understand what it is. Now, would you feel that it's important that we give some of the history leading up, or some of the background, the developments, recent developments leading up to the particular algorithm that we proposed? Yes? Yes. And why? I agree with you. It is important. Why is that important? In the back? Yeah, so people might want to know, it's exactly right. They might want to be brought up to date if they're not already up to date. If they are up to date, then they know about everything except for your work. All right? And the easiest way for them to understand what it is that you're trying to tell them about is to show them how it relates, how it's similar to what they already know about, and how it may be different from what they already know about. So this is another reason why understanding your reader's background, understanding your audience is important, because you can use that to draw analogies between your work and what's already out there. These similarities and differences are a really good, quick way to explain to them, to at least paint a quick picture of what it is that you've done in your research, how maybe your algorithm is different from what other people have done in the past. Okay? And by seeing that right away, that might help them realize why it's better in certain situations, or different, more suited to a different problem setup. Okay? Good. So after you've painted some of this historical background, one more reason why it's good to tell people a little bit about the story, the historical development leading up to what you've done. Okay? Especially if you're going to in general, let's say. One other good reason is because some of the people that are most likely to be interested in reading your article are other people who are working in this field, right? And people naturally like to see their name in print, right? So if they've done something, if they've made previous contributions, then they want to see that you recognize what they've done. Okay, but this is important to keep in mind when you're writing some of this related work. When you should picture yourself speaking to the people who did that work, and you want to tell them, okay, well, here's the important contribution that researcher X made. They showed that if we do this particular experimental setup, we can show that these particular type of event is going to occur. And now we've taken and we've built upon this and shown that if we modify the setup, we can do things a little bit differently, and we can show that even something bigger is occurring. Right? So people like to see how you've taken what they've done and built upon it. They want to see these relationships. And so one good thing to do is when you're telling this story, picture yourself speaking to the people who have done that work in the past. Okay. Then you get to the point where you want to summarize your contributions. And this is where you want to say, in plain words, as simply as you can, what is it that you've accomplished? You want to be precise, okay, but you want to do it in plain words. So I would say leave the technical details for later. All right, that's what the body of your paper is for. The introduction is just to paint the broad picture. You do want to summarize what are your contributions, though. All right? And I would say, as it's highlighted in red here, this is usually the most difficult section for me. All right? So I usually hold off on this one until close to the end. But it's difficult because you need to capture the reader's attention. Right? What happens is that, I don't know, how many of you have read papers this summer that you didn't like or that you found difficult to read? Right? Yeah, it's not uncommon. Scientific writing is something that people are still really trying to improve on. And it's because oftentimes people don't put much thought into their writing. They start to write and they just want to write, get it over with as quick as possible, get something published and move on to the next project. And it's understandable, right? Because when you're starting a new project, it's exciting. You want to go off and get more results. Writing maybe isn't as exciting, but it's important if you want people to read what you've written and to learn about what you've done, that you take some time to do it. All right, so my advice is maybe don't start writing the introduction right off the bat. Hold off on this until the end. But make sure that whatever you do write captures the reader's attention, and maybe consider putting the most effort into the abstract and the introduction. Last point, if you get to the introduction and you feel yourself having writer's block, there's a trick called the telephone trick, which I think is useful. Have any of you ever heard of something called the telephone trick before? Do you have an idea what it might be? No. All right, so the telephone trick is the following. You picture yourself speaking to one of your friends. Pick a friend who is in this audience of this particular, let's say, journal that we're writing to. So maybe it's another friend of yours in your lab, one of the grad students in the lab, a friend at another university who's doing similar research. Picture yourself calling them up and having a conversation with them about what you've been doing this summer, or what research it is that you want to write about. All right? And you have to explain to them in words why you did this and what you've accomplished. All right? And if you're having problems just picturing this in your mind, then I would say take it one step further and actually do it. Call up your friend, pull out some tape recorder or digital recorder, whatever you have, record the conversation, and you'll find that it's very useful later on to take some of that and use that to write out this introduction. Because maybe if you've read papers that you did like this summer, at least the papers I find that I like are the ones where I feel like the author is speaking to me, not where they're trying to teach me something necessarily, but where they're maybe telling a story or speaking in a way that makes it very interesting. And usually that's what you do when you're talking on the phone in person, as opposed to trying to write something down technically to your computer. Okay? So that's the introduction. Okay, so then we get to the body of the paper. That's what comes next. And here's where you're going to tell the reader what you did and how you did it. All right? And so at this point, if the reader is still reading your paper, then you've accomplished your goal, right? Once they get to this part, they're probably going to keep reading the rest of it. All right? So once you've got them in, this is where you can start to go into more of the technical details. You can tell them how you did what you did, what it is that you accomplished. And it's important to make sure that you include enough details in the body of the paper so that your reader, who will assume is a knowledgeable individual in this field, they could go off and they could do the same experiment, or they could work through the same analysis and come to the same conclusions that you've come to. All right, so it's important to justify the statements that you make, explain the assumptions that you're making, put in as much detail as you can. Okay, sometimes if you have very fine technical detail that might not be of interest to all readers of this journal, then that's when you put things in your supplemental material or in your appendices at the end of the paper. Okay, so some of this comes with practice, some of this comes with just reading lots of papers and seeing how other people do it in ways that make sense to you. But I think with time this will come and this will make sense. One thing that's important in the body, but I would say also in the entire paper, this was just a good place for me to stick it in a slide, is this idea of using intellectual honesty, as much as possible throughout your paper. All right. So, I mean, by intellectual honesty, I'm not talking about plagiarism. Plagiarism is also important in the sense that you don't want to plagiarize at all. But I'm going to assume that that's common sense. I'm going to assume that intellectual honesty is also not encompassing, say, inventing data or inventing results. We have to be honest with all of our research in the sense that what we're reporting is true and genuine. What I mean by intellectual honesty is the following. If you get to some point in your writing and you realize when you were doing an experiment, something surprising happened, okay? And it worked or it didn't work, and you were surprised by that, tell the reader that you were surprised, because they're probably going to be surprised too when they read it. Right? So you can say the surprising thing was that this actually worked and we got these incredible results. Likewise, if your analysis or your assumptions or your methods have some limitation, tell those to your reader. Okay? Because many people, especially as you advance, when you're reading a technical paper, you're reading critically. Right? So every time you read a sentence, you should be thinking, okay, do I agree with this? And chances are, if your paper has some limitation, somebody's going to read it, and they're going to see that limitation, and they're going to want to stop you right there and raise their hand and say, hey, wait a second, that's not right, or that's not always right. Okay? And if you are honest in your paper and you admit that you have those limitations, it cuts them off right there. And it says, okay, I acknowledge that this procedure may not always work, or I may not, my results may not hold in general, but for the specific case that I considered, this is true. All right? And it shows the reader that you're aware of these things. And this is especially important if you're going to be submitting this work to a peer-reviewed conference or a journal. Right? Because before your paper is published, it's going to be read by reviewers. And they're going to evaluate your work. And they're going to try to evaluate whether they agree, whether they find it to be true, correct, all these things. And so if they come up with any excuse to potentially reject it, that's usually what reviewers will do. So by being intellectually honest in this sense with them, you can avoid those types of problems. Okay? Good. Last point on this slide, when you get to the body, is to organize your paper in a logical manner where the logical manner is going to be logical to the person who's reading your article. Not necessarily the order in which you did the work, not necessarily the order which is logical to you after you understand all of the conclusions in your results. Okay? So this is a tricky thing to do too. And I think maybe this